Please be seated. The record will show the presence of the jury, the defendant, and all counsel. You need Dr. Samuels back on the stand. Good morning. Dr. Samuels, you are still under oath. Do you understand?
Yes.
We'll give you a moment to get situated. Okay. You may proceed.
Thank you. Good morning, Dr. Samuels.
Good morning.
All right, I wanted to begin our discussion today about amnesia.
Okay.
I know we talked a little bit about it last week, but I have some things I want to clear up with you.
Sure.
Can we talk first about transient global amnesia?
Yes.
Can you tell us what that is?
Well, it's a type of amnesia that can occur with a relatively modest stimulus. It may last for a short period of time, somewhat longer, usually is not permanent. There are numerous things that can bring it about, apparently.
All right. Last week we showed on the slide something that, an article, it was a review article, I believe.
Yes.
And in that review article, it talked about some of the different things that can cause transient global amnesia.
Yes.
Can you first tell us what's a review article?
That particular article, a review article, is one where the authors go to the bother of doing a global research on a particular area. They read all of these articles. They synthesize some conclusions from those articles, and then they write a summary article, which is what I read.
So you read the summary article?
I read the summary article. There were 119 articles that were reviewed in there.
All right. And in that summary article, did it talk about some of the things that can cause transient global amnesia?
Yes.
And on the slide last week, one of the slides talked about things like being immersed in hot water or cold water.
Yes.
Can that really cause transient global amnesia?
Well, apparently it can. These were documented from patient reports and other examinations of cases that appeared in the archives of people who study these things.
All right. And so what's the point of talking about transient global amnesia?
Well, I wanted to point out to the jury that amnesia is not necessarily a fake or made-up kind of experience. It occurs fairly commonly in the population, 3 to 8%, or 3 to 8% of every 100,000 cases. So 3 to 8% of every 100,000 cases. It's a small percentage. But the fact of the matter is that it's regularly reported. And so it is not as if amnesia can only be made up as to cover up something.
And now, is this transient global amnesia, what we're talking about right now, that can be caused by some, would you characterize them as minor type?
Relatively minor.
And these relatively minor type actions like immersion in hot water or cold water, is the basis for the amnesia is because it's a shock?
Probably so.
Okay.
The etiology is not completely understood.
All right. And when I say shock, I'm saying like shock to the system, the person.
Yes, a shock to the system.
Okay. Is that something that Jodi suffers from?
No.
And what is it that you would say that Jodi, what type of amnesia does she have?
The type of amnesia that she...
Rule 703, 702, ultimate issue.
Just may we approach?
You may.
All right, Dr. Samuels, before we get to talking so much about Jodi, let's talk a little bit more about dissociative amnesia. Can you tell us what it is?
Dissociative amnesia is a form of amnesia. There are several different types of amnesia, but this is a form of amnesia that appears to be based upon the fact that memories were not initially established due to an interference with the hippocampus. And it usually has a specific beginning and a specific end or period of time when memories are not being formed, and the individual cannot retrieve memories for that period of time.
Is there something that triggers this, these memories not being formed?
That's right. Generally speaking, they would be a very severe trauma, some severe incident. It could be a killing. It could be a bomb going off. It could be a number of different factors. Whatever it is, likely producing an acute stress disorder, where the physiological changes that occur create a flow of chemicals to the hippocampus, which blocks it from storing memory.
Judge, may I approach?
Yes.
Dr. Samuels, I'm showing you what's been marked as Exhibit 529. Do you recognize that?
I do.
Okay. Is that a picture of the brain that we used last week?
Yes.
Slide?
Yes.
All right. And does this help you to explain when we're talking about the hippocampus and the different parts of the brain that are affected during acute stress and causing this dissociative amnesia?
Yes.
Judge DePence would move in Exhibit 529.
I do believe we have a ruling on that from last week. It's motion for reconsideration. I would ask that it be denied.
Judge, may we approach?
Yeah, approach, please.
All right, Dr. Samuels, here's the picture of the brain that we looked at. Oops. Okay, so you were discussing what happens when somebody goes into acute stress, which then can cause dissociative amnesia. Is that correct?
Yes.
Can you tell us then the acute stress, what is happening in the brain?
Well, signals first flow into the amygdala, which is the seat of emotion. And that, in turn, places the body in a fight or flight situation if there is a threat. That produces a flood of adrenaline, a constriction of peripheral capillaries to reduce the likelihood of bleeding out if you're attacked, increases the blood pressure, increases the awareness of the surroundings. It also tends to shut down the gray matter, or it's actually sort of yellowish matter up there, the area that surrounds the brain, which is generally thought to be responsible for our executive capabilities, our thinking, our creativity, and so on. The purpose of that reaction occurring is to save the life of the individual who's under threat. The chemicals also have a negative impact on the hippocampus, which is that light green area adjacent to the blue area, which is the amygdala. Yes, that's it. The hippocampus is the seat of memory. Without a properly functioning hippocampus, memories are not formed and are not coded into long-term memory. Now, long-term memory does not reside in the hippocampus, but instead is somehow, we're not sure, coded into the protein, we think, of the general brain, which is why if a person has a brain injury to relatively small area of the brain, they still have memories. It's not as if they lose certain memories due to an accident like that. It's sort of a redundancy that's built into the coding. And so if a memory is not formed, we call that the inability to remember those things amnesia. Now, dissociative amnesia is usually associated with criminal behavior. And according to the research, the more intense the trauma, the more likely and the more complete the amnesia. The amnesia has a finite period, rather the loss of memory covers a finite period of time, usually as long as the stressful situation is occurring. Perhaps I could draw a diagram.
Would that make it easier to
I
explain?
think it might be easier if I could just show that.
Sure.
I'll hand this to you, obviously. Okay.
Did you initial it?
Oh, sure. Okay.
May I approach, Judge?
I'm not a good artist here, so.
Hi, Dr. Sandwich. You drew us a diagram that's been marked for identification as Exhibit 530. And the diagram, how does it help you explain what we're talking about?
Basically, what it does is that it shows the function of normal memory and then interference with the capacity to remember, which produces a decline in the ability to store memories, and then a gradual return to more normal memory development.
All right. Judge's defense would move to enter Exhibit 530 into evidence.
530 is admitted.
Okay.
All
If
right.
you start off on the left-hand side.
All right. You can actually touch your screen if you want to.
Oh, great. Okay, terrific. So we have a memory. This is a memory function. Now, this is very arbitrary and pictorial. This is not exactly what goes on in the brain, but this is the easiest way to describe it. Our capacity for memory, let's say it's 100%. That doesn't look like 100% at all, but okay, say that's 100%. until a trauma or stressful situation occurs. At that point, the chemicals start flooding into the hippocampus, interfering with its ability to store memories, and the capacity for memory begins to decline until it reaches some lower level. When the stressful situation is over, or the person is removed from the circumstances that create the stress, the chemicals stop flowing into the hippocampus. They are eventually washed out by other chemicals, and the capacity for the hippocampus to create new memories begins to return. And you can see a gradual increase. Now, this increase is not necessarily complete. It's not 100%. It's not like it was a light switch, one moment on, one moment off, and then on again. But it's a gradual and fairly sloppy return. That represents the loss of memory that we refer to as dissociative amnesia.
And when somebody has this loss of memory, when they're down here at the bottom of the scale, or bottom of your drawing, do those memories, do they ever come back?
If they're not there, they can't come back. They're simply not there. Now, what might happen is that it's possible that in the course of this, there are slight hills and valleys within this loss of capacity. So flashes of events may be vaguely remembered, but there's no way of knowing in advance whether that's going to happen. But the key is either all of the memory or the bulk of the memory is lost. And indeed, dissociative amnesia is associated with crimes that occur in a state of extreme emotional circumstances. And the more intense the crime or intense the distress, the more complete the amnesia tends to be.
And when you say more complete, what do you mean?
The loss is greater. The loss is more permanent. Most of what's occurred is not remembered, as opposed to perhaps some of it being remembered.
All right. Now, last week you said that you had met with Miss Arias several times. Is that
Yes.
right? About how many times did you meet with her?
I think we met about 12 times.
And do you have an idea about how many hours you spent with her?
Probably between 25 and 30 hours all told. But that did not include the time that I took to test her. I didn't add that time in.
Oh, okay. So 25 or 30 hours of just speaking with her.
Speaking with her.
And then additional time when you did the testing.
That's right.
During that time, did you discuss, did she talk to you about what happened and what she could remember?
Yes. Well, the first few times I met with her, as I mentioned, Thursday. I guess it was Thursday? Thursday, okay. She did not reveal what actually happened. She was telling this story about intruders. I think that's...
His characterization of what really happened, he's now vouching. He can tell us what she told him, but...
Sustained.
Go ahead. You can continue.
Okay. So that was the story that she was telling me. And at some point, Mr. Nurmi and I went to visit her, and we encouraged her to reveal the truth. And finally...
I don't object to his characterization. It's a change in the story. He can't say it's the truth.
Sustained.
Okay, I understand. I understand. She changed the story and admitted to us that she had done the killing.
Okay. And then after that point in time, did you discuss with her what had happened and the points that she remembered?
Yes.
And did you discuss with her the points, the gap in time that she did not remember?
She remembered, and this was fairly consistent in the numerous times that I asked her this, because part of the examination process is to bring up the same area in several different ways. So it seemed pretty consistent to me that she remembered the point when she dropped the camera. Mr. Alexander, according to her story...
He's saying it was consistent, and again, he's vouching. He can tell what the stories are. He just can't tell us.
Sustained.
May I, Judge? With regard to the...
Approach, please. You may continue.
Okay. Dr. Samuels, you talked about the consistency. So when you're talking about that, that has to do with what she remembers? In other words, when she's talking to you on different occasions, is she reporting to you that she's remembering the same things?
Yes.
Okay. So is she consistent in that manner to you?
Yes.
And the gaps that she does not remember, are those gaps, have they been consistent with you?
Yes.
And where her memory picks up again, has her memories with regard to where it picks up again, has that been consistent?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So when you're speaking with Miss Arias about these things, does it ultimately lead you to a conclusion about what the type of amnesia she might have?
Yes.
And what is that?
It appears as if she suffers from dissociative amnesia.
All right. And that's what we were just talking about here, right? With the memory function and the time.
That's correct. This area here is the period of dissociation.
Okay.
And I might point out
Yes.
that the beginnings, such as here, and the ends tend to be foggy and hazy. And that's classically how it goes, because as the memory function is either gradually deteriorating or gradually being restored, memories can begin to occur, but oftentimes they're reported as being foggy or fuzzy.
Okay. And so the foggy or hazy memory is occurring as the brain is going into the complete loss?
Yes.
And as the brain's climbing out of the complete loss, it's also foggy and hazy?
Yes.
Okay. All right. And with dissociative amnesia, are there ever a chance of pieces of memory coming?
Sometimes bits and pieces.
Overruled.
Sometimes bits and pieces of memory can be retrieved. I have done a good deal of hypnosis work looking for restored memories with police departments of officers who were suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. It is generally not too effective. Very rarely some piece of detail will be recalled, but it's rarely productive.
All right. And is that ultimately, I'm showing you exhibit number 529, is that ultimately because there is no memories stored in the gray matter from the traumatic event?
That's correct. The memory has never been encoded into a form that the brain can store long term.
Okay.
And once gone, it's gone.
Okay. Now, one of the criteria for post-traumatic stress was intrusive thoughts.
Yes.
Is that right? And intrusive thoughts are what?
These are thoughts usually about the trauma that pop up into the actors or the individual understudies thinking. They can't control it. They come in sort of random times. Sometimes it may be at night, sometimes in the morning. Sometimes they may hear something that triggers an intrusive thought, but those are what we call intrusive thoughts.
All right. And did Miss Arias suffer from intrusive thoughts?
Yes.
Well, let me ask you, how can that be if she doesn't remember a big gap of what happened?
The intrusive thoughts that were referred to me, that were mentioned to me, involve the beginning of this traumatic event. She recalled herself being chased.
Checked on the grounds of vouching.
She reported remembering that he was threatening her life. And then at the end, she began to remember becoming reconnected to her environment while on that road in Arizona covered with blood. That's the other part of the intrusive memories. So the intrusive memories appear to be those that occurred at the very beginning of this trauma and as she was coming out of that hours later. So those were the intrusive memories that were repeated to me.
All right. And so are those things that pop up into her memory without control?
Yes.
And is that what makes them intrusive?
Yes, because you can't really control them. They just pop up.
Okay. I forgot to ask you last week, with regard to, when we're talking about your education and work and profession, are there, with regard to psychology and medical doctors, Are there complaints that can be made?
Yes, complaints can be made to the examination board by just about anyone, actually.
And is there a specific area where doctors receive complaints more often than others?
Well, obviously, it depends on your specialty, but in the field of psychology, complaints tend to cluster around custody disputes, and indeed that did happen to me once.
Lack of foundation, how he knows that these complaints are clustered in that area.
Sustained.
Well, Judge, he just was finishing a sentence where he said he knows that because it happened to him.
I'm going to sustain the objection.
Dr. Samuels, do you know other psychologists?
I know psychologists, I know people who are members of the board, I read the board listings, and it is very clear and well known.
Well, before you say that.
Yes.
Knowing the other doctors that you know, and you said you read the board listings?
The board of psychology produces, well, they used to do newsletters, now it's on the internet, indicating board actions against certain people.
And is there a general thought that complaints against doctors occur in more areas, different areas than others, more often in a different area?
Yes.
And do you know that based on the fact that you know all these different doctors and you read these other publications?
Yes, and it's commonly discussed amongst professionals.
Okay. And what is that area?
Custody evaluations.
Okay. And in custody evaluations, do you have an idea as to why this is something that is ripe for complaints?
Well,
Relevance, lack of foundation.
Approach, please. You may proceed.
Okay, Dr. Samuels, generally speaking, with in your area with regard to custody situations, is that something that has issues with it with regard to getting complaints, doctors, you or other doctors in that area?
well, sure, there's always one winner and one loser in custody evaluations. So invariably, you're only satisfying 50% of your clientele. And so those types of complaints are not at all uncommon.
And did you ever have a complaint against you?
I did.
Could you tell us when that was?
Yes, it involved the 1994 or 1995 custody evaluation that I was asked to conduct. It was an extraordinarily acrimonious divorce. There were multiple lawsuits between partners, attorneys, psychologists, psychiatrists. It was a big mess.
What was your role in it?
My role initially was to be the joint custody evaluator. The gentleman came to see me, and I tested him and evaluated him, saw him with his children and so on, but the mother refused to attend. His attorney asked me instead to provide a letter to her office indicating whether or not I viewed him as a competent parent. I did, but it was not a full-fledged custody evaluation because I never evaluated the woman.
Okay.
I was then told that this was no longer a case of custody and that the only issue was visitation. About 4 weeks later, the wife calls my office and asks to make an appointment. I call the attorney of this gentleman and tell him that she's finally come in. She asks me to please test her, but that the evidence and information would not be used in a custody determination because I was no longer doing custody. I explained that to the woman who decided to come in with her children, and I observed her. And I made the observation that she too was a competent parent, no contraindications to either one of them parenting the children.
Did you ultimately testify in that case?
I did not testify as a custody person. I
Okay.
did not testify as a custody evaluator. The gentleman then called me up in tears, begging me to see him as a patient because he was having terrible troubles. His business went bankrupt. His wife, of course, they had split. He was having tremendous financial problems. He was a dentist. And he asked me to see him for therapy.
Now, are you allowed to do that when you're a custody evaluator?
Well, I formally contacted his attorney and I resigned as custody evaluator. And I stated that I would not testify as a custody evaluator. And since custody was no longer the issue, I felt appropriate with that. And of course, I obtained letters from the attorney releasing me from that role and so on. So I started seeing this gentleman. And at some point, he owed me a good deal of money. And he told me that he was going bankrupt. He had no money. And he offered, because he wanted to continue seeing me, for me to see him. And I had looked in the American Psychological Association ethical guidelines, and it said that bartering was permitted as long as it did not, what was the terminology? Did not compromise the relationship. So professional to professional was perfectly fine, which is what we did.
Okay.
And somewhere down the line, I went to court to testify only as to his mental state, because he was now a patient, and that the condition he was suffering from, which was an anxiety disorder and some depression, would not impede his ability to spend visitation time with his children.
All right. And so at the point that you're testifying down the line, you weren't supposed to be for the husband and the wife
That's
together.
right. At this point, I was simply I testified as a therapist.
Okay.
And there are other complications, but I won't go into it. At any rate, about a year later, a complaint was filed to the New Jersey Board of Psychological Examiners, and they brought up this case, and part of the case involved the fact that I bartered. Now, unbeknownst to me, New Jersey passed a ruling that did not permit bartering as part of the psychological guidelines. There was a 3-month overlap between the time that I started bartering with him, which was permitted nationally, but not permitted by the state. So
let me just get that straight. So in the beginning, when you were going to him as a dentist,
right,
that was okay.
that was okay.
But there was 3 months that you were continuing to see him as a dentist, and that New Jersey had changed the
New
rules.
Jersey had changed the ruling, and I was not made aware. I didn't know that. They may have sent out a bulletin, and there was no internet in those days, so they may have sent out a bulletin. I may have missed it. I wasn't unaware of it. At any rate, the wife and her attorney boyfriend found some records that we had done this exchange, and decided to file a complaint that I was bartering inappropriately. The New Jersey board examined this material and decided to fine me $2,500 for having done that. And no license was taken away, nothing was suspended, just the fine. The next step was that in psychology and in the field of medicine, if someone makes a complaint to one board, every board that you're on is notified, so they can do their own independent examinations. Letter went out to the American Psychological Association, in which I am a fellow of 2 divisions, and they decided not to take it up. It was trivial. The American Board of Professional Psychology, where I'm a diplomate, decided not to take it up. The Arizona Board, 2 years later, decided to take it up, and I was exonerated in a vote of 13-0, and the complaint was dismissed. And that was the one and only time in dealing with thousands of patients, at least over 1,000 evaluations, that anyone ever lodged a complaint. And as I said, both the attorney and the psychiatrist involved in the case were also complained about by this particular party.
So you weren't the only one who got a complaint from this lady?
No, it was a messy case.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. And so is that what you mean by do you do custody evaluations
No,
anymore?
after that I decided not to do custody evaluations anymore. It just didn't pay.
Okay. All right. You talked, well, besides working with the phenomenon of PTSD quite a bit, you had mentioned earlier that you also worked with sexually violent perpetrators and have done psychosexual risk assessments?
Yes, when coming to Arizona in 1988, 89 or thereabouts, Arizona had passed a new law called the Sexually Violent.
Yes. We are going to take the noon recess at this time. Please be back in the designated area at 1:25. Please remember the admonition. You are excused.
Please stand for the jury.
The record will show the jury has left the courtroom. Dr. Samuels, you may step down. We are in recess until 1:25. Counsel, I will see you in chambers. Please be seated. The record will show the presence of the jury, the defendant, and all counsel. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. Ms. Wilmot, you may continue with direct examination.
Thank you, Your Honor. All right, Dr. I believe that we were talking about your experience with regard to your general experience with regard to sexually violent perpetrators and psychosexual risk assessments.
Yes.
Could you tell us, can you kind of explain to us what your experience is in that area?
Well, back east, before I came out here, I was often referred through the courts cases of sexual abuse or sexual molestation that I was asked to do an evaluation of to help determine the relative risk of the perpetrator. I also dealt with victims of child sexual abuse and also with rape victims as part of my regular routine. When I came out to Arizona, Arizona had recently passed the sexually violent perpetrator law, and that involved a jury deciding on whether or not someone who has already served their term and is being released it meets a certain criteria that would involuntarily commit them to the state hospital for treatment of their deviant sexual proclivity, usually cases of pedophilia or rape or voyeurism or exhibitionism. These are fairly common sexual deviancies. And I took the training that was given here, and there was quite a bit of it back in around 1990 or thereabouts. And I began to receive cases from first the public defender and then private attorneys and so on. And since that time, I've done about 660 psychosexual risk assessments or sexually violent perpetrator evaluations, roughly maybe 60% risk assessments in the other SVP. And I've also testified numerous times in the SVP trial process.
Did you ever work with people who were accused of such things?
Oh, yes, absolutely.
And what kind of work did you do with them besides these evaluations?
Well, here in Arizona, I don't do therapy any longer. But back east, I was routinely referred cases through the court for outpatient sex offender treatment. The New Jersey system is a bit different from here. And there is a fixed there was, at least at the time, a 5-year sentence that included attendance or incarceration at a special hospital that was also a prison, and they would be there for up to a 5-year period where they would receive both treatment and be incarcerated at the same time. Then they were released, and if it was felt they needed more therapy, I would be court-ordered to treat them, continuing in sex offender treatment.
Okay. And is there literature that you would have read or studied with regard to this area?
Tremendous amount.
Based on all of this information, when you would read the literature or in dealing with the people that you worked with, did you find that there was any type of behavior with regard to the family members and how they would treat the person who was accused?
If the relationship was intact, there would be a tendency on the part of the family to try to protect the one who was accused, except in cases of pedophilia where their own biological or stepchildren were involved. Then it would become more complicated, and sometimes the reports were made.
And when you say in cases, I'm sorry.
Sorry.
When you say in cases of pedophilia, do you mean that the child was actually touched or harmed?
Child molestation is perhaps a better way of this, because pedophilia is a specialized diagnosis, but child molestation cases, there would be a tendency on the part of the families to protect the perpetrator. And so many times the supportive work had to be done with family members as well. Obviously, they were victims within the family. The likelihood of protecting the perpetrator would be less.
Okay. And so when you talk about protecting the person who's been accused, what do you mean by protection?
There may not be a phone call made to the authorities, to the police, to report it. There may be a tendency on the part of a spouse, for example, to make up excuses, even sometimes to deny the fact that their own child was molested. And we see this happening fairly regularly. And it's just a natural tendency to want to protect, to want to cover up something such as child molestation.
Okay. Now, switching to a different area. I know you've talked before with us about Jodi's journals.
Yes.
And have you read them all?
I believe I did, yes.
And they started about when?
It was either junior high school or high school.
Okay. And from there, did she pretty much consistently journal?
Yes, she did.
And in her journals, you had mentioned before, I think, that she seemed to take a look at life through rose-colored glasses.
Yes, she did.
Did she accentuate the positive?
Always.
One of the issues, did Miss Arias ever speak to you about when Mr. Alexander broke her finger?
Yes.
And did this happen in January of 2008?
Yes.
Okay. I'm going to show you what's in evidence as exhibit number 456. Do you see that's a journal entry from January 24th of 2008?
Yes, I do.
And based on your information, is that a few days after Mr. Alexander broke her finger?
Yes.
Overruled.
I'm sorry, what was your answer, doctor?
Yes.
Okay. Now, this is just part of the journal entry that we have, but we see in the beginning...
Objection, this states the evidence. It is the journal entry of Thursday, January 24, 2008, and it's actually initialed at the end.
Judge, it's not the complete entry for January 24th of 2008. That's what I said.
All right. Overruled. You may continue.
All right. So we have this partial entry of from January 24th, 2008. And we see in the beginning, she says that there has been nothing noteworthy to report. Do you see that?
I do.
Okay. Now, if we look at the entire entry from January 24th of 2008, she actually does go on to speak of Travis.
Yes.
And you see the highlighted part?
I do.
And she says in the highlighted part, well, speaking of Travis, he frustrates me and he thrills me. I love, love, love him, and he sings to me. He goes out of his way for me, displays massive amount of unconditional love for me in countless ways. You see that?
I do.
And so she's speaking very positively about him, right?
Yes.
Is this something that she did often?
Regularly.
And then she goes on to talk about how she's almost haunted by it, but it still remains that she cannot marry him. And she goes on to say, I don't have, can't, or she must, I think she cuts that out. I can't quite put my finger on it, but something is just off with that boy. We've all got head problems, and that's for sure, but there are certain things that will never sit right with me about him. Do you see that?
I do.
All right. And based on your information, this was days after he broke her finger, right?
Yes.
And this information, this journal entry is altogether part of January 24th of 2008. Is that right? Is this, in this journal entry, is that consistent with the way she would write things, negative things?
Yes, they were very mild.
Just a recommendation, what other negative things has he seen?
Judge, the foundation is he's read through all her journals. He's aware of the different journal entries when she would speak negatively about Mr. Alexander.
All right. Overruled.
Whenever she would be writing about Mr. Alexander, it was generally very, very positive. If there were any problems, she would usually couch it in terms of somehow she did something to displease him. And she was just very effusive and positive about him. I don't remember seeing a negative thing written about him.
And when you say negative, do you mean something that's detailed negative?
That's detailed negative, that's right. Good point.
Okay. And did she ever talk to you about the law of attraction?
Yes?
And what is that?
Well, the law of attraction is...
Do you know what the law of attraction is?
well, I have an idea. It may not be exactly what she's thinking about it, but yeah.
Based on what Miss Arias told you, do you know what she believed it to be?
She believed that if you put positive...
Relevance as to his opinion then.
Councilor Pritch, please. You may continue.
All right, Dr. Samuels, with regard to the law of attraction, did Miss Arias speak to you about it?
She did. She talked about it fairly frequently.
Okay, and what did she talk about that it meant to her?
Well, it meant that if you put positive statements out there, if you have a positive attitude towards life, then life will treat you to positive experiences, and you will grow through that. So you have to sort of create your own future by putting out positive vibes and by expressing the goals that you have in life and so forth. And apparently it was part of what she was learning with the prepaid legal plan.
Okay, and thank you. And did she talk to you about her journal writing with regard to the law of attraction?
Yes, she did.
And in your reading of her journals, did you see that she would mention the law of attraction?
Oh, many, many times.
And so when we're talking about something where she talks about that there's just something wrong with that boy, is that consistent with somebody following the law of attraction by being not too negative?
Yes.
All right, I wanted to talk to you about PTSD and its effects on the effects that it has on people. Okay? First, I want to ask, does everybody who experiences a trauma, like something that puts them into acute stress, so a severe trauma, does everyone who experiences a severe trauma often then lead to PTSD?
No.
Okay, how does that work?
Well, typically, maybe I shouldn't use the word typically, but one of the characteristics of a post-traumatic stress disorder is that people who are so diagnosed share a common set of symptoms. The symptoms are listed in the DSM. And one of the characteristics that remains consistent is the fact that they have undergone an atypical stressor. In other
I'm
words,
sorry, you said atypical?
atypical.
Okay.
Atypical, meaning not typical.
Okay.
Meaning that it's a stressor out of the realm of normal experience. So it's less likely to develop if a person has a mild automobile accident. It's more likely to occur if they're involved in a killing situation. Not everyone who suffers from an acute stress disorder or from even milder forms of stress will develop PTSD. And the criteria are very specific. But if you've been diagnosed with PTSD, then there are a series of repetitive, consistent stimuli that is shared by a group of those that receive that diagnosis. And not everyone who's diagnosed with PTSD shares the exact same symptoms either, because the criteria that are placed in the DSM, for example, in one criteria, I'm not going to go into it, there are 5 possibilities, and if one of those exists, then it meets that particular criteria. Or in another case, 3 out of 7. So not everybody is exactly the same, but they do share a list of common experiences, symptoms I should say, and they all have experience in a typical or unusual stressor.
Now, what if they're the person who caused the stress? So take, for example, you said a killing. For example, if somebody gets into a car accident and runs someone over and actually kills the pedestrian.
Yes,
Can
that
the
person
who's driving, can that
person could develop post-traumatic stress disorder. There is much current research, new research, that has explored the area of can someone who is involved in harming another develop post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms. And even though I saw that regularly working with police officers that I was treating and dealing with for accidental shooting incidents, the area was never really studied until the past 10 years or so. But the evidence that does exist does suggest that people who are involved in causing harm to another can develop PTSD as a result of the harm they have caused.
All right. And actually, before we get all the way into PTSD again, when you first met Miss Arias, did you have an opinion with regard to her self-esteem?
Yes, I did.
What was that?
That it was very low.
And how do you form such a thing? How do you know that?
Well, based upon her history, what she was telling me at the time about her past relationships, about her childhood, how she was reared, certain interactions she had with her parents, it almost cried out to me that this is a young woman who was suffering from very low self-esteem.
And when somebody suffers from low self-esteem, can that make you more likely to suffer from other diagnoses?
Well, we find that low self-esteem is a characteristic of many different kinds of psychological disorders. So the answer to that would be yes.
Okay. And throughout the time that you met with Miss Arias, did you ever notice a change in her self-esteem?
Yes, over the years, I found that her personality seemed to strengthen. She became somewhat more self-confident, more assertive. She was able to communicate more freely and openly, and I saw that as a positive indication.
All right. And was that always the case?
With her, you mean?
Later on, when you see that she became stronger or more confident, was she always like that?
No, she was not. I mean, people have their ups and downs. Some days she would be depressed. Some days she would be more outgoing. Other days she would be more apprehensive. But in the typical course of working with someone over time, you do see those changes.
And that brings up another issue, too. You say working with someone over time. The time that you spent with Miss Arias was for what purpose?
The purpose was to conduct a thorough evaluation and develop a report with a diagnosis. And the approach that I took was to spend several interview sessions, develop rapport. I think I may have mentioned this the last time. And then, of course, in Miss Arias's case, we had to overcome the fact that she was still in an acute state of denial and was not able to deal with the reality of what had happened. Although she finally came about and shared what we believe to be the true story.
Objection, that believes to be the true story.
Sustained.
Oh, okay, go on.
Okay, she told a different alternative version. And so that allowed me to spend more time delving into the facts, or to the best of her recollection, of what actually happened on that fateful night. Yeah.
All right, and so, do you spend time, when you're spending that time with her, is there ever a purpose for therapy?
Well, not when you're doing an evaluation, and I would very often almost have to restrain myself and not do therapy because that wasn't my role. But I did see a growth within her as she became more comfortable with the story that she ultimately changed to, which she told us. And so, no therapy that I would call therapy was conducted.
Okay, and if you were treating her, if she was actually a patient of yours and you were conducting some sort of therapy, what would you see her more often?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Of course, things are different now in psychotherapy than they were when I first started because of insurance limitations and insurance companies changing the rules. But on a regular basis, someone like Ms. Arias would probably be seen a couple of times a week if we lived in an ideal world for the first few months, and then perhaps once a week. Over a period of time, it would titrate down to maybe twice monthly, then once a month, then 6 months, until they no longer felt they needed it.
Okay. But like you said, that was not your goal. You were doing evaluation.
I was doing only evaluation.
Okay. All right. So when somebody is diagnosed with post-traumatic stress, how does it have an effect on their ability to express emotions?
It can, because one of the characteristics, one of the criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder is blunted affect.
What is a blunted affect?
Blunted affect means a constriction in their ability to show and express emotion. So we will see an emotive state that doesn't seem to jive with what they're talking about. There's a disconnect sometimes between the emotion connected to the statement and the statement.
And do we know why that happens?
It may have to do with emotional constriction. Right now, I'm venturing into the psychotherapeutic jargon. I can't tell you what structure in the brain is responsible for that, but we know that it's not atypical. It happens when the person suffers from this particular disorder. There's a restricted range of affect. We see that happen. A feeling of detachment, a disconnection, sometimes to relationships, sometimes to situations.
Do they have that detachment when they're talking about the situation that caused the trauma that can be responsible for the PTSD?
Sometimes it's so horrific that you can't deal with it openly. You have to skirt the issue. You have to cushion yourself, because once you start talking about what you experienced, it can break you down, and it's almost like a re-experiencing of the actual trauma. So yes, that's quite common in this type of disorder.
What about if the person is under stress at the time that they're discussing, that they're talking? Does additional stress, can that affect somebody who's been diagnosed with PTSD?
Well, it can. It depends upon the topic that's being discussed as well. But we know, for example, that it can be very difficult for a soldier to talk about a particularly bad experience that they've had. And part of the therapy helps them to get to the point where it can be brought out in the open. But one would not just dive right in there and start presenting them, hammering them with this experience again, because that could be very detrimental to their treatment.
So if the person is, for example, with Ms. Arias, if she's testifying, is that considered, generally speaking, a stressful situation?
Yes.
Like a foundation.
He's testified, so he has the foundation, and it's relevant as to her.
Overruled, you may answer.
Yes, testifying for anyone can be stressful. And so, yes, testifying for her probably would have been stressful.
And so when you add that stress upon her being diagnosed with PTSD, does that cause any additional issues with regard to the blunted affect? Does it make it more or less likely or things like that?
Well, I can't say exactly what would happen to a particular person. It has the potential for doing that. Okay. Has the potential for confusing them. It has the possibility, rather, of eliciting intrusive thoughts that distract the person from answering the particular question. But I can't say for sure.
Generally speaking.
Generally speaking is what I am sure about that.
Okay. Part of this detachment that you talk about, is that a defense mechanism?
it can be a defense mechanism to block the individual's contact, psychological contact, with the initial stressor. So in some cases, sometimes amnesia can actually be a help by protecting that person, although it's not caused by that necessarily. It's caused by the fact that the memories aren't actually inscribed in the brain. But yes, by creating an alternative reality, which we call derealization, a person puts distance between themselves and the actual event, which may have been very horrific.
Is that something that you have seen in your practice?
Oh, yes.
Does that happen frequently or normally, or?
It's hard to give a percentage, but I have seen it enough to be aware that it does exist as a possibility, yes.
All right. And did you see any evidence of Miss Arias doing things, you said derealization?
Yes.
Did you see any evidence of that?
Well, initially when the story was told about these intruders, that to me was a disconnect from reality.
Okay. And what about, we know that she called and left a voicemail message for Travis after she left his house on June 4th. What does that tell you? Again,
I would have to say that this is typical. I'm talking about examples here. But it could very well have been the result of her need to distance herself emotionally from the horror that occurred on that day. And by pretending, but not necessarily on a conscious level, but by creating her alternative reality, it's as if it didn't happen, and it reduces the level of stress. Strange as it sounds, these things do occur.
We know that after that, she went on to Utah and spent some time with a person named Ryan Burns. And to all accounts, things seemed normal for her. Not from her, but by other people explaining her behavior. Is there a psychological explanation for that?
Well, it's the same type of, it's basically depersonalization.
Defendant's mental state. Overall.
It's another way of the mind trying to put psychological distance between the horror of the event and the reality that that person has to live with. Keeping in mind, in Ms. Arias' case, that she apparently had no one that she could confide in, not a mother, not a father, not a friend. She was doing this all by herself, and the stress must have been incredible.
We know that she spoke to a friend, Leslie Udy, and made statements about the wish for her children someday to play with Travis's children someday. When we all know that was not going to happen now. Is that the same type of behavior you're talking about?
Yes, it is. It almost borders on the delusional, but she did not meet that particular diagnostic criteria.
Okay, so to be clear, you're not saying she was delusional?
No, I'm not.
Okay, all right. So what do you mean then?
Well, what I mean is that the alternative reality that is created is so contrary to what actually happened that it would be very difficult for a person to even make those statements if they genuinely, some part of them didn't believe that or weren't functioning as if the alternative reality was reality.
Okay. We know that she sent flowers to Travis's grandmother afterwards, once the news broke that he had passed away. Is that along the same type of behavior?
It's along the same type of behavior. There may have been some genuine sorrow on her part, too, but it would be consistent with this concept that I was discussing previously.
Okay. And well, let's move on for a sec. Let's talk about tremors and shaking, okay? When you were meeting with Miss Arias, did you ever notice her having any tremors or shaking?
I did. There were times, and sometimes it was content related, that I would see her hand shaking like this. And but that's one of the criteria of post-traumatic stress disorder. In fact, it's called, the characteristic is physiologic reactivity upon exposure to internal or external cues that symbolize or resemble an aspect of the...
What are you reading from, Doctor?
I'm reading from the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which I've reproduced on this page.
Okay, so
but
the
it's
DSM.
the criteria from the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual.
Okay.
We can mark it then.
Well, actually, it's already been marked. Doctor, do you have the DSM with you, the red book?
I don't have the red book today. I brought my little portable version.
Okay, then we'll have to mark that then.
Okay. But I do need it back. Yeah, here it is. Yeah. Okay.
Please mark it as Exhibit 531. How is that different from the big red book you had on Thursday?
This is just a portable version. It doesn't have a lot of the explanatory text in it, but it does have all the criteria for all the disorders. So this is, we carry it around.
Okay.
Easy to carry.
All right, so you were explaining to us what the specific criteria is in PTSD
Yes.
with regard to how shaking or tremors follows or falls into that. Is that
It
right?
would fall into that particular criteria.
All right, and you were reading it. Did you finish reading it?
I did.
Okay. Can you tell us what that meant? Because it was...
What it means is that a person responds physiologically. Now, it could mean a number of different physiologic or physical changes, but in this case, I viewed the shaking or the tremor as being the physiologic reactivity. So when we were talking about certain issues, I can't say for sure that it was only when I would speak to her about the incident, but there may have been internal or other internal cues that were triggering that. I did observe her shaking on a number of occasions.
All right. And when you observe her shaking, is it something that is like epileptic type shaking, or is it more mild?
No, it's much milder.
Okay. Is it something that if you weren't looking for it, would you necessarily notice it?
No, you might not notice it.
And sometimes you gave us an example before. You raised your hand and saw it shake.
Right.
If her hand was down, is that something that you would notice?
Probably
then?
wouldn't notice it as much.
Okay. And what is this? Did she talk to you about the shaking?
She did tell me on a couple of occasions that she would shake. And in fact, I inquired further when I saw that. And she explained how the shaking began, I think it was around, I don't want to give a date and not be sure, but I think it was 2007 or something. I'm just venturing a guess here. And when Mr. Alexander would get angry at her, she noticed that she began to shake. So if he would lose his temper at her, she reported to me that she would have that shaking reaction.
Okay. And the times that you saw her shaking, was it during times that you were speaking of the incident, or do you know?
I don't know immediately. I didn't play around with that. It came and went. I didn't want to get into areas that would necessarily cause the shaking. My time was limited with her. So I didn't do an experiment to see. But I did notice there were times during certain parts of the conversation that she would begin to shake. And eventually, at some point, she mentioned to me that she was experiencing that shaking.
Okay. Does the shaking, is that a form of an of anxiety?
Yes, it could very well be the result of elevated anxiety.
Okay. And anxiety is something that is part of PTSD, is that correct?
It's a characteristic of PTSD.
Okay. We know that Ms. Arias has said that when men in particular yell at her or raise their voice to her or are aggressive with her in any way, that causes her additional stress, basically anxiety.
She told me that, yes.
Okay. Is that, well, did she talked about that with you?
Yes, we talked about that.
All right. And what about it?
Well, she said that if a man especially is yelling at her or upset with her, that's when she begins to feel most tense, most anxious, and also indicated that sometimes she shakes.
Okay. And when somebody is having anxiety, now this, I guess, this type of anxiety or stress, I guess, this would be far different from the type of acute stress there was on June 4th. Is that right?
What I'm talking about here is typical normal anxiety that most people experience at one time or another.
All right. And when people experience what you say typical normal anxiety, what type of results do you see?
Well, we may see in some people a jittery knee. They start bouncing their knee up and down. They might scratch their head. There's a displacement activities. They might feel warm. The skin may turn red. Their heart rate may go up. Their hands may get cold and clammy. These are typical symptoms of an elevated state of anxiety.
Do you ever find people have a problem with finding their words or remembering something?
Well, yes, many people experience a cognitive disruption when they're extremely anxious, and they may have difficulty concentrating. They may have difficulty in word finding. They may have difficulty remembering certain things. This is a fairly common occurrence, which we also know is stage fright. Even skilled and experienced actors and actresses will go onto the stage and report that prior to their performance, they begin to experience stage fright, which is really just a form of anxiety related to the performance anxieties, the performance stresses that are about to occur to them.
So like somebody who would forget their lines.
They might forget their lines, right? Exactly.
Okay. Is this something that would be considered, assuming it happened once in a while, is this something that a person should get mental help for or mental treatment for?
It depends. One of the characteristics of an issue that requires mental treatment is if it interferes with the life of the individual. So most people go through life without experiencing psychotherapy because they can sort of deal with it, some people more effectively than others. But when the issue interrupts your flow of life or creates problems for you, if you find you can't get on a bus to go to work or the light rail, and you can't do that, or you can't get in your car, or you can't get stuck in traffic, then obviously that should receive the attention of an appropriate therapist.
Okay, but the normal everyday stage fright that people might have, like a kid taking a play and getting afraid to stand up in front of people, is that something you would consider mental health treatment is needed?
No. In fact, having some anxiety is probably healthy because you begin to learn how to tolerate it, accept it, overcome it. So experiencing anxiety is actually helpful in some respects for making a person more confident in their life.
So I guess just as long as it doesn't interrupt your life.
That's basically the difference. Yes, that's basically it.
Okay. All right, I want to talk to you about the crime scene, okay? So these are, well, basically, what do you know? What you know of what happened on June 4th is based on what?
It's based upon the crime scene photographs that I was shown, police reports, interviews with at least one detective, and what later on I was told by Miss Arias to the degree that she was able to remember.
Okay, and when you say interviews with a detective, do you mean you read interviews?
No, there was a video recording of some interviews.
Okay, so in other words, you didn't conduct the interview?
Oh, no, I did not.
Okay, but you watched interviews of a detective?
Yes.
Okay. And looking at the photos and the information that you know that you've gathered from all of...
Judge, may we approach, please?
Yes.
continue.
Could you repeat the question?
Yes, because I don't even remember what it
Yeah.
was. Okay. What I want to talk to you about, we talked about what you've looked at in terms of the police reports and listened to interviews. Is that correct?
Yes.
And you looked at the crime scene photos. And is that a yes?
Yes, that's yes. Sorry.
I saw you
Sorry.
shaking your head. And you also, did you also speak with Miss Arias?
I did.
Okay, and based on all this information, is there something about the crime scene that tells you more about or supports your diagnosis for PTSD and the likelihood of acute stress?
Well, certainly PTSD was not diagnosed until after the event, but there is some indication that she was in a state of acute stress.
Okay, so that's what I want to talk about, the indications that she was in a state of acute stress.
Yes.
Okay, so what is it, based on your review of things, what is it that indicated that she would be in a state of acute stress?
Well, there was a certain irrationality to the...
State of mind, irrationality.
Sustained.
Let me ask you specifically. I think I know where you were going. Is there? We know that.
What counsel's statements are where he was going.
Okay. Are you aware that whether or not a gun was found at the scene?
No gun was found at the scene.
Okay. And are you aware that Miss Arias has a vague memory of getting rid of it?
Yes.
Okay. And are you aware that the camera was found at the scene?
Yes.
And are you aware that Miss Arias is a photographer?
Yes.
Are you aware that when the camera was found, it was found in a washer?
Yes.
And are you aware that as part of the camera, the SD card was still inside?
Yes, I was aware of that.
And are you aware that the SD card was not trampled on or ruined in any way?
Yes.
Are you aware that Miss Arias took the rope that was used to tie her up earlier in the day?
Yes.
And ultimately left the camera?
Yes.
What about in the crime scene photos, based on the blood in different areas of the bathroom and in the hallway, what does that tell you about a struggle occurring?
Foundation. He's not a blood spatter expert and state of mind. So where the struggle may have happened, he doesn't know.
Sustained is phrased.
The fact that there's blood in more than one area, does that mean that to you that there was movement in the bathroom?
Objection. He's not an expert in blood spatter, indicating how the blood got there.
Judge, you don't need to be an expert to know if blood's in different areas the person moved.
Counsel approach, please. You may continue.
Okay, based on the crime scene photos that you reviewed, did the did the bathroom area and the hallway, did it seem disorganized to you?
Yes, it did.
Are you aware that Miss Arias' handprint was left on the wall?
Yes.
And are you aware that her hair was found?
Yes.
Are you aware that on the camera in the washer were pictures of Miss Arias?
Yes.
And then,
Objection to the state's testimony. Pictures that were deleted.
Overruled.
thank you. Ultimately, Mr. Alexander's body was, where was it found?
It was found in the tub.
In the tub or the shower?
In the shower.
Okay. And found in the shower, based on your reading of the report and everything that you knew, was he put there?
Yes.
And based on what we know, it would have been Miss Arias that would have had to do it, right?
Yes.
So what does it take for someone the size of Miss Arias to put someone the size of Mr. Alexander into a shower?
Objection. A scene reconstructionist. He doesn't know where she's worked out. She doesn't know what she looked like at that time. Can't possibly know that.
The state is phrased.
Do you know if it would take strength for someone to lift up someone heavier than they are?
Objection, relevance, and beyond the scope of his teachings as a psychologist.
Overruled. You may answer.
Yes, it would take a great deal of strength, of excessive strength, for someone Ms. Arias' size to move.
Objection, lack of foundation as to what Ms. Arias' size were. Objection, lack of foundation as to how much Mr. Alexander weighed.
The state has to foundation.
Dr. Samuels, when you met Miss Arias, this was what, in December of 2009, right?
Yes.
Okay. And have you seen photos of what Miss Arias looked like in 2008?
Yes.
And did you see photos of what Mr. Alexander looked like in 2008?
Yes.
Based on those photos, was Mr. Alexander bigger than
Yes.
Miss Arias?
Yes.
And so in order for someone who is smaller, like Miss Arias, to pick up or move someone who is bigger, like Mr. Alexander, does that require strength?
Objection, lack of foundation. Again, that's beyond his expertise. He may have seen photographs. He doesn't have weights. He doesn't have heights.
Judge, can we not have speaking objections?
Sustained.
Okay. So you were allowed to answer that question. I don't think you did.
No, to me, it would take a great deal of strength to
Objection,
move.
lack of foundation. A great deal of strength. Lack of foundation.
I think we just went over the foundation.
Overruled. You may continue.
Yes, to me, it would take someone with a great deal of strength to make a move of a body under those conditions.
And earlier you had talked about, and this might have been Thursday, but earlier you had talked about people who have a great deal of strength, like the stories we hear of mothers being able to lift a car off their child in great periods of stress. Is that correct?
Yes.
And so what does it tell you then when you have somebody in pictures that you've seen, Miss Arias' size, being able to lift up someone the size of Mr. Alexander and actually put him into the shower?
It would suggest to me that she was indeed in a state of acute stress and that the adrenaline was pumping and that glucose was going to her bodies. It seems to me that she was in a flight or fight mode.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Samuels. Nothing further.
Cross-examination.
Sir, one of the things that we know is that you told us that you were hired to conduct a psychological evaluation, right?
Yes.
And that's different than being hired for therapeutic purposes, right?
Yes.
You've done both of them, haven't you?
No.
Well, you haven't done any therapy. I thought in the complaint that you had, you treated some people.
In this case?
Not in this case, ever. Have you ever done any therapy?
Oh, sure, yes.
I thought that's what... So there is a difference, right?
Oh, yes.
And in this case, the focus is on trying to reach, if you will, a diagnosis with regard to a certain event and certain facts that are presented, right?
Yes.
And with treatment, it's different, isn't it?
Yes.
With treatment, you're trying to help the individual, correct?
Well, usually there's a process of
Are you trying to
diagnosis.
hurt them or help them?
Judge, I would ask that he be allowed to answer the question.
Sustained. Okay.
Could you please repeat your question?
Are you trying to help them or hurt them when you're treating them?
Of course, I'm trying to help them.
And in this particular case, sir, one of the things that you did was that you took on you took on a treatment role with regard to the defendant, didn't you?
No, I did not.
Well, do you remember that you talked about a situation?
May we approach?
Yes, you may. Take an early recess. Please be back in the designated area at 10 minutes after 3. Please remember the admonition, you are excused.
Please stand for the jury.
Please be seated. Record will show the jury has left the courtroom. Mr. Nurmi.
Your Honor, the state knows that there's a motion in limine filed regarding my withdrawal and all the circumstances around it. It is trying to parse around this idea by saying that Dr. Samuels went there because Ms. Arias was depressed. Still not in a therapeutic role, but he knows the full explanation of which gets into a area for which there is no retort without violating the motion in limine. So obviously the state is trying to set up a situation of an unfairness to Ms. Arias under the Sixth Amendment and Trombetta to keep going into an area which he knows that the response would go into a prohibited area. Doing that, while clever, is not consistent with her Sixth Amendment right and her due process rights to a fair trial. So, Your Honor, based on that, going into an area with the explanation of which it violates a pretrial ruling of this court is just as egregious as, if not more so, than going into the area itself. We ask this court to hold the state accountable in this instance to not have them violate Ms. Arias' rights in this manner and uphold its pretrial ruling.
All right, on that issue.
The clip that I want to play and the background of it is that this is an individual who's hired at taxpayer money to go in and conduct an assessment. When the defendant is depressed, I think in violation of that mandate that he go and assess her, what happens is, this is the exchange that he and I had with regard to that issue. His answer was, so that was a big issue. And I said, okay. And then he said, she was very upset. This was not really planned. I said, okay. His answer was, but in response to her depression and being upset, I was asked to go and to talk to her. And I said, okay. And he said, so I don't know how much relative to the case. I'm allowed to go into this particular area where he has assumed a treatment role. Not only did he do that with regard to this particular issue, he also sent her gifts and that sort of thing. This is just part of that, where he crossed the line again, where he blurred the line between being someone who treats and someone who is there to evaluate.
Ms. Wilmot.
Judge, at the time that I believe that Mr. Martinez is just talking about, it's not a complete transcript. What they're doing during that interview is he's going through Dr. Samuel's notes. Mr. Martinez is going through Dr. Samuel's notes and asking him what he means by that. He says, in respect, talking about, no, Kirk leaves around the 28th. This is when Kirk's status changed, and so that was a big issue. She was very upset. This was not really planned, right? And then Mr. Martinez says, right. And then the full paragraph is, Dr. Samuel says, in respect to her depression and being upset, I was asked to go and talk to her. Don't know how much relevance to the case it is. She said that she felt no hope after Kirk announced that he was, and Mr. Martinez interrupts him, what is this, served a card at the top? And then they talk about send a card. Oh, send a card. And he's looking at his notes. He's asking Dr. Samuels to give his notes, explain what his notes mean. That's all that's said about it. But it is clearly specifically about Mr. Nurmi, when there was the possibility that he was going to leave the case, and that's specifically as to her depression. It doesn't talk about him treating her depression. It was just that he was asked to go and speak with her. There's no therapy involved. I can't follow up on this, that there was adequately follow up on this with him on redirect because what it goes into. It's completely irrelevant.
Judge, he can tell us that there was no therapy involved. He just doesn't have to tell us what the subject was. I'm not asking him what the subject was. He can say, no, there wasn't any therapy involved. I just spent an hour, 2 hours, however long he spent there, and that's the kind of thing that is allowable in cross-examination. Additionally, the fact that he's sending her cards and that sort of thing, again, that goes to the treatment aspect, not an assessment aspect, and it goes to show his bias.
Judge, therein lies the problem. If he's not going to ask him, and he shouldn't be allowed to ask him what the depression was over and why he was asked to go talk to her, that's the problem, is we can't ask that question because that question is completely irrelevant and prejudicial to Ms. Arias. So we can't go into that. So then the jury is left with this confusion and prejudicial information that she was having depression and that he was asked to go and speak with her. That's not the truth. That's not the case.
Mr. Martinez.
And Judge, I have to say, as it goes on, because I know Ms. Wilmot wasn't present during this interview, as Dr. Samuels could explain and would have to explain, Mr. Martinez completely mischaracterized what was said. The card was intended for me, not Ms. Arias, and he's saying that he's sending her cards. Again, that's completely inappropriate, and it would go right into that area of me leaving the case. So it's, again, a mischaracterization, which is habitual, but certainly illustrative of the idea that retort on this opens up a previously precluded area, and the sin is just as great for what the state is attempting to do.
I was there Card was sent to help her feel better. Had nothing to do with him. So,
Mr. Martinez, the point is that you're trying to make that therapy was provided
right.
by Dr. Samuels.
Yes. And he did. He went to see her about her depression, and then he provided a card, and it's not the only occasion that he's done it. He's done it on another occasion.
From the defense, why is it necessary to talk about the subject matter discussed if the point is only that Dr. Samuels provided therapy to the defendant?
That's the point, is he didn't provide therapy, because this wasn't a depression in the sense that an actual depression where she's going to be diagnosed with depression and therefore needs therapy. It's the fact that this news caused great problems for Miss Arias and how she felt about herself and how she felt about the case, and it causes problems then with communication between client and attorney. And so that's the greater issue, Judge. It has absolutely no relevance to therapy because there was no therapy. And again, with this card issue, the rest of the transcript bears out that the card's talking about Mr. Nermi.
Dr. Samuels, did you provide therapy to the defendant in this instance?
No, of course not.
All right, I'm going to sustain the objection to that question. Now, with regard to the other issue that was discussed at the bench, the copy of the interview, Mr. Nermi?
Yeah, oh, yes.
Detective Flores, do you have a copy of an interview that was conducted last Thursday, recording?
Yes, I can get that, and I will provide that tomorrow.
All right, first thing tomorrow morning.
Yes, first thing.
All right, is there anything else before the break?
Nothing.
We're at recess. The presence of the jury, the defendant, and all counsel. Mr. Martinez, you may continue with cross-examination.
Sir, isn't it true that on a separate occasion you actually provided the defendant with a gift?
No.
Well, sir, do you remember providing her with a book called Erroneous Zones?
Yes.
And that was something that you provided to her, right?
It was mailed to her, yes.
Which means you provided it to her, correct?
Yes.
And you provided it to her because at that point you believed that she was depressed, right?
No.
Well, let's take a look at what your testimony was. See if there's depression in the record. This is Exhibit 532. Take a look at the highlighted portion.
Yes, that is what I said, but actually that book is not...
Sir, that was the question. Isn't it true that you said that the reason you provided it to her was because she was depressed?
I said this here.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
You're conducting an evaluation at this point, correct?
Yes.
And providing an evaluation, as part of providing this evaluation, you're also providing a self-help book, right?
Yes.
And this self-help book talks about positive and practical advice for breaking free from the trap of negative thinking and enjoying life to the fullest, right?
Yes, that was for her low self-esteem.
Right, and this is by somebody named Dr. Wayne, or written by somebody named Dr. Wayne W. Dyer, correct?
Yes.
It also talks about if you're plagued by guilt or worry and find yourself unwittingly falling into the same old destructive patterns, then Erroneous Zones is the book for you, right?
Yes.
How is providing a self-help book really doesn't come under the auspices or under the coverage, if you will, of an evaluation, does it?
Not necessarily.
Well, no, not necessarily means it doesn't, right?
No.
And but you were there to try to assess her or evaluate her as it pertained to this particular case, right?
Yes.
And you would agree that if you were there to do that, and now you're trying to help her, there seems to be a little bit of the blurring of the lines there, don't you agree?
No, I don't.
Well, on the one hand, you want to help her, don't you? By giving her that self-help book. Yes or no?
Yes, it wouldn't be bad. Yes, I helped her.
And on the other hand, you're to provide and impartial evaluation in this case, right? That's what the code says, right?
I didn't read the book to her. I sent her the book.
But you were the one that actually provided it to her so that she could read it, right?
Yes, she was unable to get it on her own.
I'm not asking you whether or not she could get it on her own. The fact that she couldn't get it on her own, that made you upset enough to go out and buy it for her, right?
No, it didn't make me upset. I did what I did for many people and recommended
Well, I'm not
a book.
asking about many people. I'm asking about this particular case. Because you said that she couldn't get it, you went out of your way to get it and then send it to her, right?
Correct.
That required you to go buy the book, right?
Yes.
That required you to put it in whatever container there was and mail it to her, right?
No, I ordered it online.
You ordered it online. Once you received it, it went to her, correct?
It was sent directly to her through Amazon.
And when you ordered it online, that's with money coming out of your pocket, right?
Yes.
So now, not only are you sending her something, you're in a sense giving her money, aren't you?
Didn't look at it that way. I gave her a book.
Well, you're not looking at it that way, but that's what happened. You gave her money, and you gave her a book that cost you money, right?
Yes.
How much did that book cost you?
$9.
So here you are buying her a gift that's $9, right?
No, it was not a gift.
Oh, did she give it back to you?
She offered it back to me.
No, I'm not asking you if she offered it back to you. She never gave it back to you, right?
I didn't ask for it back.
Did I ask you whether or not you asked for it back?
So what are you asking?
I'm asking you whether or not isn't it true that she never gave it back to you, right?
She offered it back to me.
I'm not asking you whether or not she offered it to you. You understand that's not my question. You understand that, right?
Yes.
My question is, isn't it true that the book was never returned to you?
Correct.
And so you did this because you believed, or for whatever reason, you started to like her, right?
No,
Oh, so you dislike her.
I didn't say that either.
So you do like her then?
I can't answer that question, true, yes or no.
Well, why not? You spent how many? You went to see her on 12 separate occasions, right?
Depends what you mean by like.
I'm asking you, isn't it true that you went to see her on 12 separate occasions,
As
right?
part of my role to evaluate her, yes.
Yes or no? You did go see her on 12 separate occasions, correct?
Yes.
And you spent many hours with her, right?
Yes.
And you talked about a variety of things, right?
Yes.
You spoke about her relationship, right? With Mr. Alexander?
Yes.
Right? You spoke about previous relationships, right?
Yes.
And you spoke about some sexual issues that were involved with her and Mr. Alexander, correct?
Yes.
You spoke about a lot of things during those 12 visits, right?
Right.
How many hours did you spend with her?
Between 25 and 30 hours.
And during that time, you're saying that it was just a mere passage of time. It wasn't because you liked her that you decided to get that book for her.
Typically, when
Yes
I
or
have...
no? Is that why you decided to get her the book?
Could you repeat your question again?
Isn't it true that even after all this time and after all these visits, the reason you got her this book, you're saying is just because there was no reason?
There was a reason.
And the reason was that you wanted to give her something, right?
No.
Well, you did give her something, didn't you?
Yes.
And there is a code of ethics, correct?
Yes.
And that code of ethics prohibits you from providing gifts to somebody like the defendant, doesn't it?
It wasn't a gift.
Sir, isn't it true that it went over and it got to her, didn't it?
She was suicidal at the time.
I'm not asking you whether or not she was suicidal, right? Am I asking you that?
No, you're not.
And if she was suicidal, you're not the treating physician, are you?
I'm not treating her.
Well, if she was suicidal, it was somebody else's responsibility to take care of it, right?
Judge, objection. Can we ask the state not to yell at the witness? It's not necessary. Please.
may continue.
You were not the treating psychologist, right?
That's correct.
Somebody else was where she was residing, right?
I don't know.
You're not familiar. We've been told that she was at the jail. You're not familiar with the care that's psychological care that's provided in a jail?
We never talked about treatment for her.
Sir, you're telling us that as you sit here today, you are not familiar with the care that's provided by the Maricopa County Jail?
I am familiar, but I don't know.
So that's my question. Yes or no, you are familiar, right?
Not with every aspect, no.
Well, you're familiar with when there's a issue of suicide. You know what what is required of you at that point, isn't there?
To some degree.
Well, no, you're the psychologist who knows the rules, right?
Yes, most of them.
Well, with regard to the fact that somebody is suicidal, you don't just, because as a psychologist, if you take that threat seriously, you don't just walk away. If it were just a patient that you were treating, you would make arrangements, wouldn't you?
Of course.
You would, if necessary, you would call the police, right? Right?
Well, if there was an imminent threat.
Sure, you would call the police, right?
Yes.
And in this particular case, you told us that you thought the defendant was suicidal, right?
She was telling us that she was going to kill herself.
Sir, now you're changing the story because now you're saying she was telling you.
The mischaracterization of changing the story.
Sustained.
Sir, didn't you tell us just minutes ago that she was suicidal?
She told us she was suicidal.
I understand that's what you're saying now. I'm asking you to think. You don't have any memory problems, do you?
No.
I'm asking you to think back to maybe 5 minutes ago. And 5 minutes ago, isn't it true that you told us, when I was asking you about the gift, you told us, well, she was suicidal. Do you remember that spontaneous statement coming from you?
Yes, but I didn't mean that she was going to kill herself right there. She had told everyone.
Sir, I'm asking you if you remember the statement, yes or no.
You're not allowing me to explain this.
All right, counsel, one at a time. The court reporter can only take one person speaking at a time. Dr. Samuels, you may complete your response. Objection sustained. You may continue.
Go ahead.
Repeat your question, please.
Isn't it true, sir, that with regard to this issue involving the suicide, you told us previously that, quote, or words to that effect, that she was suicidal when we were discussing the gift? Do you remember telling us that? Yes or no?
Yes.
And if you did believe that she was suicidal, you had a duty then, at that point, to notify somebody, didn't you?
Yes, her attorney was informed.
But you also had a duty to let other medical or psychological health care workers know about this, right?
My only contact with Ms. Arias was through the attorney. I don't have contacts in the jail, and I don't have any authorization to contact anyone in the jail.
So you're saying that with regard to this particular situation, if a person's unrepresented and they tell you that they are suicidal, what you are going to do is walk away because you have no contacts in the jail.
Objection relevance.
Overruled.
Is that what you're saying?
I'd like to explain what the word suicidal meant in this particular context.
Sir, you used the word, didn't you?
I did.
That's all I want. And when somebody is suicidal, isn't it true that the guidelines require you to make a telephone call or let somebody else know, right?
Suicidal, the word suicidal was my abbreviation and my shorthand for explaining the fact that Ms. Arias had told me that she had been planning to kill herself prior to her arrest and even during her incarceration. That's what I used when I wrote suicidal. That was my note. Those are the words that I used.
And you didn't inform anybody in the jail to give them a cautionary note that you believed, based on your conversations with her, that she was suicidal, right?
I contacted her through the attorney, which is all of my contacts to the jail are done through the attorney.
Sir, I'm not asking you about that. I'm asking whether, isn't it true, that you didn't tell anybody in the jail that you believe that this individual was suicidal?
Objection as to the answer.
Overruled.
No, I did not contact anyone within the jail.
So you have this, what appears to be a relationship with this individual that you feel is appropriate that you buy her at least one gift, correct?
I bought her a self-help book.
You bought her a book, which is a gift, correct?
Well, I don't characterize it that way, but you may.
Well, no, I'm asking whether you talked about this. You paid for it, right?
Yes.
You never got it back, right?
Right?
And it was for a purpose that you believe was to help the defendant, right?
Yes.
And so if you're now helping the defendant, you're there assisting her, aren't you?
I did not conduct therapy.
I'm not asking you if you conducted therapy. I'm asking, the question is, isn't it true that you were then there to assist her? You are assisting her, aren't you? By giving her this book, right?
Okay.
Is that a yes?
Yes.
No, not I guess. Isn't that a yes?
Yes.
And when you gave her this book, your expectation was that she would get better from whatever problem you perceived, right?
My expectation was that she would read the book.
Right. And the reason you wanted her to read the book was so that she could address in a meaningful fashion whatever issues you saw.
Yes.
And that's to help her, right?
Yes.
And that is the problem. That creates an issue of your objectivity in this case, doesn't it?
I didn't think so.
I know you didn't think so, but on the one hand, you can see that you are helping her to get better, and on the other hand, you have to be impartial, right?
Yes.
And that creates an ethical dilemma for you, doesn't it?
Well, it didn't at the time, and it's something that I tended to routinely do, so I didn't see it as an ethical dilemma.
You didn't see it as an ethical dilemma, but you can see that there's an appearance here that you're trying to help her, right?
Yes, from your perspective, yes.
Not from my perspective, from anybody's perspective. Isn't it true that from anybody's perspective, you are trying to help the defendant get better with regard to whatever issue she has?
Objection, speculation is what other people may think.
Oh.
Could you repeat your question?
Isn't it true that from whatever perspective is taken, you are helping the defendant?
Yes, by providing her with the book, yes.
And so then that creates this issue that may affect or indicates that it may affect the way you view your evaluation in this case, doesn't it? There's not appearance.
No, it does not.
There is no appearance of that here at all.
Well, there may be an appearance to you, but...
No, I'm not asking to me, sir. I'm asking...
Objection to let him finish the answer that he had. There may be an appearance to you, but, and then he was interrupted.
Sustained. You may finish
Go
your
ahead.
response.
It may appear that way to you, but based upon her low self-esteem and the fact that she was threatening to harm herself, or was at least contemplating harming herself, I felt that with providing her with that book, it would allow my evaluation to go on.
And so it's better for you to provide her with a self-help book, in your perspective now, as opposed to mine, than to go to the authorities and say, there is this bigger issue of threatened suicide. That's what you believed.
That was communicated through her attorney.
Sure. That's what you believe.
Yes.
Sir, one of the things that you told us about was this issue that you had in New Jersey. Do you remember talking to the defense attorney about that?
Yes.
And you said, well, when I was here in Arizona, there was some sort of appeal or some sort of, some proceedings. And you seemed to indicate that whatever happened in New Jersey really was no big deal.
No, what I said was that relative to Arizona, they reviewed the entire case and I was exonerated by a vote of 13-0.
So you were exonerated by Arizona, which indicates that, from your point of view, that you did nothing wrong in New Jersey, right?
No.
And in fact, didn't you sign an agreement with the state of New Jersey agreeing to desist and ceasing from crossing boundaries with clients and entering into relationships which may create conflict of interest with the client?
And that had to do with the bartering issue.
Yes or no? Did you enter into that agreement?
Yes.
And that's the same kind of conduct that we have here, because now you've crossed a boundary involving the defendant, haven't you?
No, I have not.
So during this whole time that and with regard to this issue involving what happened in New Jersey, you indicated that you paid a fine, right?
Yes,
It was $2,500, right?
yes,
In addition to paying the fine of $2,500, you said that was all that was involved. There was more that was involved to this, wasn't there?
I had to read a book.
Pardon?
I had to read a book.
Well, isn't it true that you had to successfully complete continuing education concerning ethics and boundary issues?
Yes,
And it indicated further that these courses should be completed within 6 months of the entry of the consent order. Isn't that what you had to do?
which was resolved by reading a book and taking the test.
And this continuing education could occur either in New Jersey or Arizona, correct?
Correct.
An evaluation such as the one that you conducted is actually a sort of a two-pronged approach, isn't it?
I don't know what you mean by that.
Well, you do what is called an interview, a clinical interview, right? That's
Yes.
correct. That's one big area, correct?
Yes.
That was part of visiting her in wherever she was and talking to her, right?
Yes.
And this is the one where you previously testified that you would sit there and you would try to take notes as quickly and as accurately as you could, right?
Yes.
You don't tape record, right?
Never, no.
You would agree, though, that tape recording is probably more accurate, correct?
Probably more accurate.
And in addition to that approach, in addition to that, there's something else that you do, and that is you administer tests, right?
Yes.
And one of the tests that you administered was this PSD, right?
Yes.
What does PSD stand for?
Well, it refers to
No, without referring. Can you
Yeah.
just, to any materials?
it
Can you,
refers to the post-traumatic stress inventory.
is that the exact name of that test, or is that something that you
Well,
use?
it's
Why don't you go, hold on.
Post-traumatic stress
Sir, hold on.
inventory, PDI.
All right, you looked at something when you gave us the name. So what is it that you're looking at to give us that name?
The manual
All
that
right.
has an exact name.
Okay,
Post-traumatic stress scale, diagnostic scale. That's what it is.
How many times have you administered that test?
Probably 15 times.
And what you said to us was that you actually scored that test yourself, right?
Yes.
And this test, because you seems to have only administered it 15 times, you're having trouble with the name, right?
Oh, well, yeah.
Yes or no?
Yes and no, right. It's yes. Post-traumatic stress diagnostic scale. It's PDS, but it leaves out the S in the thing. So I was thinking PSDS, but it's post-traumatic stress diagnostic scale, PDS.
Right. And this fact that you can't even remember the title seems to indicate that you're really not familiar with this particular test, right?
I use it
Well, you've used it how many times?
about 15 times.
Right. And you've had much more cases than that, haven't you?
Yes.
And this test has 49 questions, right?
Yes.
And it has a validity scale in it, you say?
Yes.
So that if an individual is making things up, this will pick it up, right?
Doesn't always, but it's designed to try and do so. Yes.
And so in this particular case, that's one of the things that you administered, right?
Yes.
You also administered, and you called it the Mylan test. Do you remember telling us that?
No, I didn't say that.
Okay, what test? Is that the other test that
It
you
was the
administered?
Milan Clinical Multi-Axle Inventory, the MCMI-3,
And how many items are in this particular test?
175.
And with regard to administering this particular test, the way it works is there are questions, and the individual then makes a mark, correct?
Yes.
And this is the one that you actually sent to be scored, right?
Yes.
The other one, the
PDS.
post-traumatic stress diagnostic scale test, that's the one that you scored yourself, right?
Yes.
You sat down and you looked, and the way that one works is that there are 49 questions, right?
Yes.
And then there's an answer sheet, right?
Yes.
And then there's a round circle that's filled in for the answer, right?
Yes.
And again, the validity of that test depends on the person answering that test accurately, right?
Right.
And so, for example, let's say that the person lied on that test. Let's assume that that's what happened, okay? With
Yes.
regard to a PDS test. Wouldn't you agree that that would invalidate the results of the PDS test?
Yes.
And if it were used for the post-traumatic stress disorder diagnosis, that would be a faulty diagnosis, right?
Yes.
Because it is used, if you will, as a way to confirm, right?
Yes.
Well, in this case, isn't it true, sir, that with regard to this PDS, the defendant lied on it?
No, that's not true.
Sir, when was the last time that you reviewed your raw data involving this particular test?
A couple of days ago, last week.
Sir, let me have something here marked. This is exhibit number 533. And what a defendant fills out, both the test and the results, they're called the raw data, correct?
Yes.
And the raw data is not provided to attorneys, is it? Is it?
It can be.
It can be, but the code generally calls for it to be provided or to be transferred between psychologists, right? And speaking of psychology, you're a psychologist, not a psychiatrist, right?
I'm a psychologist.
Right, which means that you did not go, there is no MD after your name, correct?
No, there is not.
So you showed us a diagram or something about the head. It's not like you can go in and do surgery, can you?
No.
And you cannot prescribe, right?
That's correct.
So take a look at Exhibit 533 and see whether or not this corresponds to the actual PDS, parts 1 and 2, as well as the responses by the defendant. Take a look at it. And if it doesn't, tell me how it doesn't.
Well, I'll have to look at my my notes.
Sure, and in fact, when you take it out, if you don't mind giving it to me so that I can mark it.
I'm sorry?
Take it out of your folder so that I can mark the PDS test along with the raw data.
Oh, okay.
Do you have it out now, sir?
I have it out, yes.
If I may. So this is the worksheet, isn't it?
That's the worksheet.
Okay. But there's also a part of this test that includes the questions, doesn't it?
Yes.
If I could have that.
Here it is.
Well, sir, where are the directions for questions 1 through 15?
Oh, I don't have the actual, well, it's all in here, actually.
Well, let's
Sample of the test is in here with the questions and so forth.
okay, but where's the answer sheet to questions 1 through 15?
At the time that I went, I didn't have an answer sheet, so I had to fill it out on a piece of blank paper, which I transcribed to an answer sheet.
Sir, do you remember providing the raw data to somebody by the name of Janine DeMarte?
Yes.
And you're saying that what you provided to her is a copy of the yellow sheet that you have there?
No, I provided to her the transferred sheet.
Right. In other words, you provided her a white sheet with little round circles
That's
that were
right.
filled in, right?
That's correct, yes.
Where is that?
I don't have it with me, apparently.
Well, why don't you have it with you?
I must have left it on my desk. Must
Sir,
have left it on my desk.
isn't it important to have a complete file so that you can answer whatever questions come up?
Well, I have the answers over here.
I'm not asking about the answers. I'm asking about the other portion of the test. The one that's got the little round circles that you provided to
Yes,
somebody
I
else.
did not bring that. What I brought was the original that she filled out, that I later transferred to the question because I didn't have the answer sheet with me when I went to see her.
So what you're saying is that you're the person then who filled out the answers to questions 1 through 15?
No, I have her answers here. What I did was transpose her answers onto the sheet for scoring.
I understand what you're trying to tell me, but my question to you is much more direct than that. In terms of the answer sheet itself, the little marks, the pencil marks that were done on there, that was done by you and not the defendant.
That's correct.
And sir, if it was done by you and you were going to score it yourself, why did you use a pencil?
Why did I use a pencil?
Yes, instead of a pen.
Well, we traditionally use pencils when filling out forms such as that.
No, the reason you traditionally use pencils is because it's going to go through a computer and they're easily read that way, correct?
Yes, that's true.
And you can't use pens, or you don't use pens because it's difficult for the computer to read them, right?
And also if you make an error, it's harder to change your answer.
But in this particular case, you were going to score it, right?
Yes.
So why go through all this trouble of using a pencil if you're going to score it when a pen provides better markings?
Objection, asked and answered. He already answered that it's typical for him to use a pencil.
Means.
I prefer to use a pencil.
And that's so that you can make some changes on it if you want?
So are you implying that I cheated on that test?
No, sir. I'm asking you some questions. However you want to take them is up to you. I'm just asking you some
Okay, ask me
questions.
the question again.
So the question, sir, is you chose not to use a pen. Instead, you chose to use a pencil, which is normally what a person who is taking this test uses, right?
Yes.
And you then sat down and you did conduct this particular test, right?
Yes.
Let me go ahead and have the yellow sheet, please. And if I may have the book, please. This is exhibit number 527. What does this contain, sir?
That is the manual that is associated with that test. It includes instruction manuals for scoring, sample answer sheet, sample worksheet, and some validation information.
I move for the admission of exhibit 527. Take a look at exhibit number 534. What is it?
.534 is a sheet of responses that Ms. Arias filled in, which I then transferred to the actual score sheet.
And what date was that?
This date here?
Yes, sir.
Oh, the day that I administered, I have
No,
to
no,
go.
no, just, hold on.
Yeah.
Just show you where the date is, okay?
Okay. Oh, 1/15/10.
All right, that's January 15th of 2010, correct?
Yes,
And this is the original, right?
I believe, yes.
Good job. If I may have it stapled again, it'll be.
Yes.
I move for the admission of exhibit 534. And so this test here, which was administered on January 15th of 2010, was before this was during the time that she was telling you the story about these two men, two individuals, a man and a woman, coming in and doing harm to Mr. Alexander, correct?
One moment, I'd just like to check something out.
All right. Why don't I have it marked so that you can take a look at your notes and we can maybe make it a little quicker.
Okay.
So take a look at Exhibit 536 and see if that refreshes your recollection as to administering the PDS and the fact that at the time that you administered the PDS, she was still telling you that it had been the intruders who had killed Mr. Alexander.
Yes.
Okay? I'm going to have that back. And this test, this PDS test that you administered, the one that we have here with the answers, this test reflects the fact that her story is still the fact that it was two intruders that actually killed Mr. Alexander. Doesn't that reflect that?
Yes, if it was taken at that time, it would.
It did, didn't it? And in fact, the portion that you don't have in front of you would show us that that was in fact the case, right?
Yes.
Let's take a look at, you have mine up there, correct?
Yes.
And that, have you taken a look at it? Is that a copy that accurately reflects the answers in Exhibit 534 as to questions 1 through 15? And I'll give this.
Please. Yes.
Okay. I may have that back. I move for the admission of exhibit number 533.
Is 533 the actual, something that Dr. Samuels typed up or something that the state typed up?
It's a true and accurate copy of of that particular part of the test and the defendant's response, according to Dr. Samuels.
That was his testimony.
I heard, okay. Well, I would object unless it's an actual copy that Dr. Samuels has.
Overruled. Exhibit 533 will be admitted.
Okay, so let's take a look at exhibit number 533. There are some instructions that go with this, right?
Yes.
And the instructions are part of this manual here, exhibit 527, right?
Yes.
And they're the ones that indicate what questions there are to be asked.
Yes.
And whatever the answers are, right?
Yes.
So with regard to the first question, the person who's taking this, in this case the defendant, is asked to identify whether or not any of these events, serious events, have occurred in their life.
Throughout
right?
their lifetime, correct.
Right, because these kinds of events are the kinds of events that trigger these responses that we've been talking about. Loss of memory, right?
Yes.
That trigger the foggy memory, right?
Yeah.
And, for example, the first one says, serious accident, fire, or explosion. For example, industrial, farm, car, plane, or boating accident. And the defendant answered yes to that one, right?
Correct.
With regard to number 2, natural disaster, for example, tornado, hurricane, flood, or major earthquake, the defendant also answered yes to that one, right?
Yes.
Number 3, she's asked about non-sexual assault by a family member or someone you know. When it talks about someone you know, it isn't talking about you. It's talking about somebody the defendant knows, right?
Yes.
And it says, for example, being mugged, physically attacked, shot, stabbed, or held at gunpoint by someone you know, right?
Yes.
And she said, with regard to that, yes, right?
Yes.
And then she says, number 4, non-sexual assault by a stranger, right?
Yes.
For example, being mugged, physically attacked, shot, stabbed, or held at gunpoint. It's the same question as above, number 3, only this one talks about a stranger, right?
Correct.
And she answered yes, right?
Yes.
Number 5, sexual assault by a family member or someone you know, for example, rape or attempted rape. She said no to that, didn't she?
Yes.
We heard testimony about issues from the defendant previously that she indicated something about a situation. I'm asking you whether you're familiar with a situation where she claims Mr. Alexander may have taken her clothes off and may have penetrated her. Are you familiar with that?
Yes.
And you characterized that one as a rape, didn't you?
Yes.
When we had our interview.
Yes.
But here, number 5, she says, no, it wasn't that, right?
Yes.
And between the two of you, she was there, right?
Yes.
And she would know better than you, right?
Correct.
Speculation.
6, sexual assault by a stranger, for example, rape or attempted rape, and she said no to that, right?
Yes.
7, military combat or a war zone, she said no, right?
Correct.
Number 8, sexual contact when you were younger than 18 with someone who was 5 or more years older than you, for example, contact with genital breast, and she said no, right?
Yes.
And then it says imprisonment, for example, prison inmate, prisoner at war, hostage, and she said no, right?
Correct.
Continues on with question 10, and question 10 asks about torture, and she said no, right?
Yes.
Number 11, life-threatening illness, she said no, right?
Correct.
With regard to 12, there is other traumatic event, and she says yes, right?
Yes.
And then she says number 13, if you answered yes to item 13 specifically, specify the traumatic event on the answer sheet, right?
Yes.
And she said repeated emotional and psychological abuse, right?
Yes.
Then this test goes on to part 2, right?
Yes.
And it is asking the individual who's taking this test, in this case the defendant, a question, right?
Yes.
And this is one of the guiding questions that determines or substantiates or confirms or helps you confirm the presence of PTSD, right?
Yes.
And in fact, the way you indicated were that, in your report, were that her scores on the post-traumatic stress disorder scale confirm the presence of PTSD, right?
Yes.
It says here, if you mark yes for more than one traumatic event in part 1, indicate which one bothers you the most. If you marked yes for only one traumatic event in part 1, mark the same one on the answer sheet, right?
Yes.
And she's asked about the same 12 questions that we've just gone over, right?
Yes.
And the one that she indicated was the traumatic event in her life that triggers this post-traumatic stress disorder is what? Why don't you read number 4?
Non-sexual assault, stranger.
Not somebody that she knows, right?
Correct.
You said that you reviewed the photographs of the crime scene, right?
Yes.
And you talked about Mr. Alexander being in that shower, right?
Yes.
He's not a stranger, is he?
No.
He's somebody that she knew, right?
Yes.
And it's talking about that the thing that triggers it for her, this PTSD, is non-sexual assault by a stranger, correct?
Correct.
And the rest of the questions that you have here in Exhibit 534, all of the answers here, are based on the fact that she had an assault by a stranger, right?
That's what she said in that test.
Well, no, let's go back to this just so we make sure. 533. It says, why don't you read it for me?
Below
And make sure that I can bring it in, the whole thing. Okay?
Below are several questions about the traumatic event you marked in item 14. Non-sexual assault, stranger.
And these are the questions that I have in my right hand, right? These are the answers, right?
Yes.
This is her worksheet, right?
That's right.
Did you turn this worksheet, a copy of this worksheet over to Janine DeMarte?
Yes.
And this is a true and accurate, or this is the actual item that the defendant filled out,
Yes.
right? Take a look at it. 535.
Yes.
I moved for the admission and it took 535.
You may. 535 is admitted.
And so with regard to Exhibit 535, you said this is what the defendant filled out, right?
Can I see that? I'm not sure whether she did or I did. No, I did.
And
Judge,
Yes.
so with regard to Exhibit 534, this contains the answers to it, right?
Yes.
For example, 534, you said this is the one that the defendant filled out, right?
No, I don't remember.
Well, sir, let me do it this way.
Okay.
Isn't it true that previously you told us that this is the one that the defendant filled out, right?
I believe so.
And isn't it true that you said that whatever markings are on here are those of the defendant, right?
Well, those are in my hand.
Okay,
I
so
believe. At least part of it is.
So, for example, part 2, where it says circle numbers that apply, that's your writing circle numbers that apply, right?
Yes, that's my writing.
And under 14, it does circle number 4, right?
Yes.
Did you circle that or did she circle that?
I honestly don't recall, but I think she circled it, or she gave me the number and I circled it. I don't recall.
And then, down at the bottom of it, you say expands for assault, life-threatening, right?
Right.
And that was important to you. That's why you wrote it, right?
Right.
She didn't write that down there, right?
No, I wrote that.
And this is an assault that's life-threatening by a stranger, right?
That's what she said at the time.
Well, that's when you filled out this test, right? So that's
Yes, that's what she was saying at the time.
And one of the things that you told us previously on a direct examination was that, well, in terms of what she was telling you, you believed that she wasn't telling you the truth initially. Do you remember telling us
Yes,
that?
that's correct.
Yet you administer this test and you write these notations down, even though you believe those are not true, right?
That's true.
Why are you writing down untruths?
Because this was her perception at the time. This was her story of what went on at the time. The test was administered. These were her responses.
But you used it. You just said, knowing that this was a lie, you used it and then concluded that those scores on that PDS confirm the presence of PTSD, even though you've just now told us that this is based on a lie.
Perhaps I should have re-administered that test.
Because this is one of the foundations for your finding of post-traumatic stress disorder on the defendant, right?
Correct.
And the other one is the MCMI, right?
Correct.
The other test, right? As well as your conversation with her, right?
Correct.
So let's take a look at the one that you have up there.
The worksheet.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
My question is, with regard to 535, why are you filling this out and not her? Why do you feel that you have the need to, for example, in item 16 through 19, let's talk about those. Why do you have to fill in the number here? Do you see that?
Yes.
Well, couldn't she do that herself?
No, this is for the examiner to fill out after reviewing the answer sheet. This is called a hand scoring worksheet.
Oh, so this is the score that you actually did on it, correct?
That's right. That's the scoring of her raw data.
So when you told me before that this was actually her answers, that was a mistake then?
Well, there is an answer sheet, which I have. It's probably on my desk, but that is very similar in appearance. But it's a printed form, which is what I transferred her data to. And then I scored from my transferred sheet.
And this scoring is done with reference to a guide, correct?
A reference to a scoring guide, yes.
Right. And you give it a number, right?
Yes.
And based on that number, that tells you, yes, this is a measure that can be used in support of PTSD or not, right?
Correct.
Exhibit number 534. Question number 22. You see that? There's a number there, right?
Yes.
Where's the guide that tells us why you would have to, question number 22, give her a 3?
Well, I didn't give her a 3. She scored a 3. And there is a scale on the actual answer sheet where you circle 0, 1, 2, or 3. In the manual that you have over there, it explains precisely how to do this.
So what you're talking about is exhibit 527, right?
That's correct.
So she put a 3 in response to the question, whatever the question
Whatever
was,
the
right?
item was, yes.
The question that you don't have in front of you.
Well, the questions are in the book.
Okay? Exhibit 527. Question 22. Read that one for us.
The instructions are for item number 22.
Uh-huh. Yes.
Okay, wait. There is the exact directions are here. Okay. That's not the right one. Okay. I guess maybe this doesn't have it. Hold on one second. I guess the actual test is not here. I had everything together. Wait, hold on. All right, there is a question booklet, a booklet that comes with this, which I thought was attached in this book, but it isn't. And it explains to the individual how to score these particular items, and then it has a separate answer sheet. If I don't have that with me here, I apologize. I could certainly bring it tomorrow. But I don't have, apparently I don't have it here. Some pages must have gotten lost in my file.
What you have in front of you is not the guide to score number 535.
It's not the actual question sheet that is used for this.
Right, it's
I
not
thought
the
it was
guide,
in
right.
here, but apparently it's not.
So what is that then that you have in front of you? What is it?
This is the manual. This tells you how to score it. It tells you about the validity of the test. It describes sample reports, but apparently it doesn't have the actual questions. And I had that together with the original answer sheet, and I'm afraid I left it home.
All right, if I may have that back.
Yeah.
If we take a look at page number 2 of exhibit number 534, question number 16,
Yes.
17, 18, and 19. Do you see that?
Yes.
Those are yeses, right?
Correct.
So it's 16, 17, 18, and 19. Those are 4 check marks, right?
Yes.
How come on this, and you filled out 535?
That is the hand scoring sheet.
This is the one you said you filled out.
May I? Yes, this is the hand scoring sheet.
If I may have it back. Why was there a 6 there present at first, and then you changed it?
I added them up incorrectly.
This test, sir, like all tests, is a situation where you sit down, involves a situation where you sit down with the defendant and you indicate to them that you're going to administer a test, right?
Correct.
And you provide them the materials with which to make answers, correct?
Correct.
You give them the instructions, right?
Yes.
And then there's a period of time within which this test must be answered, right?
Well, there's no time limit on this test.
How long did the defendant take to fill this out?
20 minutes or so?
But if she wanted to take more, she could have, correct?
Correct.
And during that time, she never manifested any indication to you that she didn't understand any of the questions, correct?
That's correct.
For example, exhibit number 533 that talks about the traumatic event, non-sexual assault by a stranger, never indicated any compunction or any reservation or reluctance in while you were there administering it in filling that out, correct?
Correct.
And what you are telling me is that the validity or this test really is only as good as the person who is telling or filling it out, right?
That's true.
So if they're lying, then the test is not very good.
That's correct.
And in this case, we do have a circumstance where you know the defendant's lying and she lied on the test, right?
Well, her answers didn't reflect what we ultimately discovered.
Right, so she lied, right?
Yes, or her answers may have been consistent with the story she was telling.
Well, 533, question number 14, the answer, that's a lie.
Question number 4 or 14, did you say?
Well, it's question 14.
Oh, 14 above. Oh, I see. Okay. Yes.
And she was given many choices, including right above there, non-sexual assault by someone she knew, right?
Yes.
So that is a lie, right?
Yes. It's, well, again.
Oh, hold on, sir.
Oh, sorry.
For a moment. Approach, please. May I continue?
And after this testing was done and after this answer was given, and I'm just asking about you, I'm not asking about anybody else, there was a subsequent meeting, yes or no, right?
Could you repeat that?
After this was administered, this test, 533,
Yes.
there was a subsequent meeting, right?
Afterwards, yes.
Yes. And during this subsequent meeting is when the story changed correct?
Correct.
And during that story change, one of the things that the defendant told you was that this story about the strangers was fiction, correct?
That's correct.
And that, in fact, she had been the one to actually kill Mr. Alexander, correct?
Yes.
And yet you did not administer another PDS, correct?
That was an oversight, and I should have done that.
And, sir, one of the other things is that during this conversation, or during your meetings with the defendant, you and she talked about a number of things, didn't you?
Well, sure.
In fact, one of the things that you talked to us about during direct examination was specifically the rope at the crime scene. Do you remember answering questions about that?
Yes.
Isn't it true, sir, that one of the things that the defendant told you about that rope was that she was tied at the hands, right?
Yes.
And she also told you that she was tied at the ankles. Didn't she tell you that?
Well, that's what I had in my notes.
No, I'm not asking you what you had in your notes. I'm asking you whether or not that's what she told you.
I don't remember what she told me.
Well, you have notes, though, right?
But I do have notes.
And those notes are made at exactly the time that she is relating that to you, correct?
That's correct.
And those notes reflect on two occasions, on two separate parts, that she was tied down at the hands and the ankles, right?
That's what my notes reflect, yes.
And there's no reason for us to doubt your notes, right?
No, there aren't. The
Because-
one thing, the fact is that most of the time over the years when people have said they've used rope, they tie the hands and the ankles. It is conceivable that in my attempt to write down quickly as she's talking, I may have added that by mistake, but I don't remember. So you have to go with what I wrote.
So are you confessing or saying that you were wrong in writing that down?
I don't know.
So, but isn't that the notes, isn't that what forms partly, isn't that part of the clinical interview?
Yes, it is.
And isn't that part of what has formed your conclusion that she was afflicted with post-traumatic stress disorder?
Yes.
And so, don't you think that would be important to make sure that you're accurate?
The formulation of the post-traumatic stress disorder came about after a careful analysis of the notes, the crime scene material, and her changed story. These tests, which I had administered earlier, did confirm the presence of post-traumatic stress disorder, although I was in error by not re-administering the PDS.
And I'm not talking about those tests. We'll talk about that probably tomorrow, but I'm talking about the statement to you from her that she was tied both at the hands and also at the ankles.
Yes. Well, that's what I wrote.
And there's no reason as we sit here today to doubt that, right?
No.
And one of the other things that she told you was that even though when this was going on and she was tied down, that it was actually Mr. Alexander, when this was happening, that he actually cut the ropes as he approached climax, correct?
Yes.
And he used a knife to cut the ropes, right?
Yes.
And then as he approached climax, she straddled him or got on top of him, right?
Yes.
And while she was on top of him, that's when Mr. Alexander took the photographs, the nude photographs,
That's
right?
correct, yes.
Okay? I want you to take a look at exhibits 164, 165, 168, and 169.
Okay.
Those are photographs of Miss Arias, correct?
Yes.
And those are the photographs of her sprawled or laying back on the bed, correct?
Yes.
It also shows a picture of her vaginal area, correct?
Yes.
And it also shows a picture of her backside, right?
Yes.
In none of those pictures, Mr. Alexander appears in none of those pictures, correct?
Correct.
Those are the pictures, sir, that were, well, did you ever see or look at these pictures after you talked to Miss Arias and you received the story about the pictures being taken while she was straddling him?
I saw some pictures, but I don't believe I've seen all of them.
So don't you think it would have been important to look at those photographs so that you could see if you could corroborate what she was telling you at that time was happening?
Actually, I had the photographs when I first began the case. It would have been helpful to corroborate, yes.
And that wasn't done in this case,
No.
correct? And if you would have looked at those, that would have provided you an opportunity to ask her about this particular issue, right?
Yes.
Since that's part of what goes into this post-traumatic stress disorder diagnosis, looking at what somebody tells you and whether or not it can be corroborated, right?
Well, I didn't see a major contribution to her post-traumatic stress disorder as a function of the sexual life that they were having.
But if somebody is a liar over and over with something like that, don't you think that that's something you would consider?
Objection as a characterization as someone being a liar. That's certainly not what Dr. Samuels has agreed to.
Approach, please.
Sir, hypothetically speaking, isn't it important if you have someone who you are assessing, if they lie to you over and over again, isn't it important to corroborate things?
I didn't view the story she was telling as a lie.
No, I'm not asking you about this case. I'm asking generally speaking, sir.
The information that I get in a case can be corroborated to some degree.
No, but my question, sir, is if someone, not this case, generally speaking, in your experience, all these years that you've had, if someone is constantly lying to you, not this case, if someone is constantly lying to you, don't you think it's important to attempt to corroborate what they're telling you?
If I knew someone was constantly
Yes.
lying to me, I would discontinue the evaluation because it wouldn't be worthwhile in continuing it.
So you wouldn't corroborate, you would just discontinue it then, right?
If I knew somebody was lying consistently, what would be the point of me to continue either with therapy or with an evaluation?
What if they only lied 3 or 4 times that you knew of? Would that make a
If
difference?
I was able to corroborate that, of course I would.
With regard to these photographs, our information, or you can see on there the date and the time.
Right.
Give me a date.
6408,
At what time? Give us a time.
1:42 p.m.
At that time, sir, according to your assessment, she was not suffering any of these foggy memories then, was she?
To my knowledge, that's true.
Oh, no, you're the one that told us when she was. Do you remember you did the graph?
The foggy memory occurred at the time of the killing.
Right. So at that point, she was not having any memory problems, right?
Correct?
And she wasn't foggy, right?
Correct.
So that if that's an inconsistency, it cannot be attributed to her having a foggy memory, correct?
That's true.
I don't have anything else, thank you. Well, I mean, pursuant to what we talked about, I don't have anything else today.
All right. Objection is overruled. The answer will stand. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to take the evening recess. Please be back in the designated area. Can everyone be here at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning? 10 o'clock? Have a nice evening. You are excused. Please remember the admonition.
Please stand for the jury.
record will show the jury has left the courtroom. We are in recess. Dr. Samuels, you may step down.
Thank you.